In the unforgiving desert of 1880s Arizona Territory, where death lurked behind every sun-bleached rock and mercy was rarer than water, one simple act of human kindness would either save a man's life or seal his fate forever. When rancher Thomas McKenna opened his cabin door that scorching July evening, he had no idea that the two collapsed figures on his doorstep would soon bring 150 armed Apache warriors to his front yard. He couldn't have known that his choice to offer shelter would become a legendary tale of honor, courage, and the thin line between civilization and survival in the American West. This is the true story of a moment when compassion met conquest, where a stranger's mercy would be tested by the arrival of one of the most feared war chiefs in Apache history. It's a tale that would be whispered around campfires for generations, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of humanity can echo through eternity. What happened next would challenge everything the frontier knew about enemies, allies, and the price of doing what's right when everything is wrong. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he finished mending the fence posts that had been bothering him all week. The Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and deep red. His small ranch sat in a valley between two mesas, isolated from the nearest settlement by 30 miles of harsh, unforgiving terrain. It was exactly how he liked it. The 42-year-old former cavalry soldier had chosen this remote location specifically for its solitude. After serving 5 brutal years fighting Apache raids throughout the territory, he wanted nothing more than to live quietly, raise his cattle, and forget the violence that had consumed too much of his life. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless battles, and his steel-gray eyes held memories he wished he could erase. As twilight approached, McKenna gathered his tools and headed toward his modest cabin. The structure was simple but sturdy, built with thick adobe walls and a flat roof that could withstand both the scorching summer heat and the occasional winter storm. A small well provided water, and a corral held his 6 horses and 20 head of cattle. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that meant everything to a man who had spent years following orders and sleeping on hard ground. The sound of his boots on the wooden porch echoed in the still evening air as he approached his front door. Something made him pause. His military instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, told him something was different. The usual sounds of the desert seemed muted, and even his dog, a loyal mixed breed named Scout, was nowhere to be seen. Then he heard it, a low, barely audible groan coming from somewhere near his cabin. McKenna's hand instinctively moved toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. In this part of Arizona territory, unexpected sounds often meant trouble, and trouble usually came with bullets flying. He moved carefully around the side of his cabin, his boots making soft sounds on the hard-packed earth. The groaning sound came again, weaker this time. As he rounded the corner, McKenna stopped dead in his tracks. 2 figures lay collapsed in the shade beside his cabin's eastern wall. Even in the fading light, he could see they were young Apache, probably in their teens, and they looked to be in terrible condition. The closer of the two was a boy who couldn't have been more than 16. His long black hair was matted with dust and sweat, and his traditional Apache clothing was torn and stained. Beside him lay another youth, this one appearing even younger, perhaps 14. Both were unconscious, their breathing shallow and labored. Their lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and their skin had the grayish pallor that McKenna recognized from his military days as the look of men pushed beyond their limits. For a moment, McKenna hesitated. The practical part of his mind, the part shaped by years of frontier warfare, whispered warnings. Apache warriors were considered among the most dangerous fighters in the world. They could cover vast distances on foot, strike without warning, and disappear into the landscape like ghosts. Finding two of them on his property, even young ones in distress, could mean danger was nearby. But as he looked at the collapsed figures, McKenna saw something that overrode his caution. These weren't warriors planning an attack. They were children, exhausted and dying of thirst in the brutal desert heat. Whatever had brought them to his remote ranch, they posed no immediate threat to anyone. They were simply human beings in desperate need of help. McKenna knelt beside the older boy and gently checked for signs of life. The young Apache's pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing, though shallow, seemed regular. The younger one stirred slightly when McKenna touched his shoulder, but didn't regain consciousness. Both were severely dehydrated and probably hadn't eaten in days. Without further hesitation, McKenna made his decision. He lifted the older boy carefully, surprised by how light he was, and carried him into his cabin. The interior was spartanly furnished with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and McKenna's simple bed in the corner. He laid the Apache youth on his bed, then returned for the younger one. The cabin's coolness provided immediate relief from the desert heat. McKenna quickly fetched water from his well and began the careful process of rehydrating the 2 unconscious visitors. He had learned from Army medics that giving too much water too quickly to severely dehydrated people could be dangerous, so he administered small sips, waiting between each to ensure they could keep the liquid down. As he worked, McKenna found himself studying the faces of his unexpected guests. Despite their ordeal, both young men had the strong, dignified features characteristic of their people. Their clothing, though worn and dusty, showed the careful craftsmanship typical of Apache work. Intricate beadwork decorated their shirts, and their moccasins were made from supple leather that spoke of skilled hands and cultural tradition. The older boy began to stir as the water took effect. His dark eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear immediately replacing unconsciousness as he took in his surroundings. He tried to sit up, but McKenna gently pressed him back down. "Easy there, son," McKenna said softly, his voice carrying none of the hardness that years of military life had given it. "You're safe. You were about done in by the heat when I found you." The young Apache's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in every detail, assessing threats and escape routes with an instinct that impressed McKenna. Despite his weakened condition, the boy's mind was clearly sharp and alert. He said something in Apache, his voice hoarse and barely audible. McKenna didn't understand the words, but the tone was questioning, perhaps asking about his companion. He gestured toward the younger boy, who was still unconscious but breathing more steadily. "Your friend is going to be fine," McKenna assured him. "He just needs rest and water, same as you." The response seemed to ease some of the tension in the older boy's face. He attempted to speak again, this time in broken English. "Water," he managed, his voice like sandpaper. McKenna nodded and helped him sit up slightly, supporting his head while he offered small sips from a tin cup. The Apache drank greedily at first, but McKenna controlled the flow, knowing that too much too quickly could make him sick. After a few minutes, the boy's eyes seemed clearer, and some color had returned to his face. "What's your name?" McKenna asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. The young man hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this white stranger who had shown him unexpected kindness. Finally, he spoke. "Nate," he said simply. McKenna nodded. "I'm Thomas. Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch." He gestured around the cabin. "You," and Your friend are welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. Nature's expression showed surprise at this offer. In his experience, white settlers were more likely to shoot Apache on sight than offer them shelter. The stories his people told around their fires were full of broken promises, betrayals, and violence from the white man's world. Yet here was this bearded stranger offering not just water, but refuge. As the evening progressed, McKenna prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The younger Apache, who Nate identified as his brother Taza, gradually regained consciousness. Like his older brother, Taza showed initial fear and confusion, but Nate spoke to him quietly in Apache, explaining their situation. Both boys ate slowly, their stomachs unaccustomed to food after their ordeal. McKenna watched them carefully, noting how they maintained their dignity even in their weakened state. They didn't beg or grovel for his help, but accepted it with a quiet grace that spoke well of their upbringing. As night fell, McKenna offered them his bed, saying he would sleep on the floor. Both young men protested, but their exhaustion eventually overcame their courtesy. Within minutes of lying down, both were asleep, their breathing deep and regular for the first time in days. McKenna sat in his chair beside the fireplace, keeping watch. His mind wandered to his military service and the many conflicts he had witnessed between his people and the Apache. He had seen good men on both sides killed in a war that seemed to have no clear purpose beyond mutual survival in an unforgiving land. Now, looking at these two young men sleeping peacefully in his bed, he wondered if understanding might be possible where conquest had failed. The night passed quietly. McKenna dozed fitfully in his chair, waking frequently to check on his guests. Both boys slept deeply, their bodies recovering from their ordeal. Scout, his dog, had returned and lay quietly by the door, apparently accepting the presence of the Apache visitors. As dawn approached, McKenna stepped outside to begin his morning chores. The desert air was cool and crisp, carrying the scents of sage and creosote. He milked his cow, fed the horses, and checked on his cattle, all while keeping his cabin in sight. He still didn't know what had brought Nate and Taza to his remote ranch, but he was determined to see them safely recovered before they continued their journey. When he returned to the cabin, both young men were awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and speaking quietly in Apache. They stood respectfully as McKenna entered, and Nate spoke for both of them. "We thank you for your kindness," he said, his English more clear after a night's rest. "We have no way to repay such generosity." McKenna waved off the thanks. "No payment needed. We're all just trying to get by out here." He began preparing breakfast, aware that both young men were watching his every move with careful attention. As they shared the morning meal, McKenna learned more about their situation. The brothers had been traveling for several days, making their way back to their band after visiting relatives in another part of the territory. They had become lost in an unfamiliar area and run out of water 2 days earlier. By the time they reached McKenna's ranch, they were within hours of dying from dehydration. "Where are your people now?" McKenna asked, curious about their destination. Nate hesitated before answering. "Not far," he said vaguely. "We can find them when we are strong enough to travel." McKenna sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't push for details. In this part of the world, everyone had secrets, and a man's business was his own unless he chose to share it. After breakfast, McKenna suggested they rest for another day before attempting to travel. Both young men were much stronger, but the desert could be unforgiving to those not fully recovered from such an ordeal. Nate seemed torn between gratitude for the offer and anxiety about something else, but eventually agreed that another day's rest would be wise. The morning passed peacefully. McKenna went about his usual ranch work while his guests rested and recovered. Occasionally, he would see them standing at the cabin's windows, looking out toward the surrounding desert with expressions of concern. When he asked if everything was all right, they assured him it was, but their behavior suggested they were watching for something or someone. By midday, both Apache brothers were feeling well enough to help with some of the lighter ranch chores. Despite McKenna's protests that they should rest, they insisted on contributing something in return for his hospitality. Nate proved skilled with horses, while Taza showed a natural ability with mechanical tasks, helping to repair a broken harness with remarkable skill for someone so young. As they worked together, McKenna found himself genuinely enjoying their company. Both young men were intelligent, curious about his ranch operation, and eager to learn. They asked questions about cattle ranching, water management, and the challenges of living in such isolation. In return, McKenna found himself asking about Apache customs, their traditional ways of surviving in the desert, and their perspectives on the changing world around them. The conversation was enlightening for all three men. McKenna discovered that his preconceptions about Apache culture were often wrong or oversimplified. Nate and Taza, meanwhile, seemed surprised to find a white man who was genuinely interested in their traditions and treated them as equals rather than curiosities or threats. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, McKenna noticed that his guests had become increasingly restless. They frequently stepped outside to scan the horizon, and he could see tension building in their posture and expressions. "You're expecting someone," McKenna observed, not making a question. Nate looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Our father," he said simply. "When we did not return, he would have sent warriors to look for us." "When do you think they might arrive?" McKenna asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the chill that ran down his spine. "Perhaps tonight," Nate replied. "Perhaps tomorrow." McKenna nodded, outwardly calm, but inwardly calculating. If Apache warriors were coming to look for these young men, his situation had just become much more complicated. He could only hope that their father would be grateful for the care his sons had received and not view McKenna's presence as a threat. As evening approached, the three men shared another simple meal. The conversation was more subdued now, with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present before. Both brothers seemed grateful, but worried, while McKenna found himself wondering if his act of kindness was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and darkness settled over the desert. McKenna lit a lantern and settled into his chair while the brothers prepared for another night's rest. But sleep seemed unlikely for any of them. In the distance, carried on the evening wind, came the faint sound that all three had been waiting for. The rhythmic drumming of horses' hooves, growing steadily closer. The sound grew steadily louder through the darkness, and McKenna realized with growing unease that this wasn't just a few search party members. The drumming of hooves suggested a much larger group, perhaps dozens of riders approaching his isolated ranch. He stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving toward his revolver, then stopped himself. Drawing a weapon now would only escalate whatever was about to happen. Nate and Taza had both risen from the bed, their faces tense with anticipation and what McKenna thought might be fear. The older brother moved to the window and peered out into the darkness, his body rigid with concentration. "How many?" McKenna asked quietly. Nate listened for another moment before responding. "Many," he said simply. "More than you might expect for a search party." McKenna felt his mouth go dry. In his military days, he had faced Apache war parties before, and he knew their reputation for swift, devastating attacks. But he also knew that if they had meant him harm, they would have already struck. The fact that they were approaching openly suggested something different was happening. "Should I be worried?" McKenna asked, trying to keep his tone light despite the gravity of the situation. Taza spoke for the first time in hours, his young voice carrying a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "Our father is not a man who acts in haste," he said. "But he is also not a man who forgives easily when his family is threatened." The hoofbeats were close enough now that McKenna could distinguish individual horses. He estimated at least 50 riders, possibly more. Through the cabin's windows, he could see the faint glow of torches in the distance, moving steadily toward his ranch like a constellation of fallen stars. Nate turned from the window, his face grave. "Mr. McKenna," he said formally, "there are things about our family that we have not told you. Things that might change how you feel about helping us." McKenna looked at the young man, noting the dignity in his bearing despite his obvious concern. "Why don't you tell me now, while we still have time to talk?" The two brothers exchanged a glance, and Nate seemed to come to a decision. "Our father is Geronimo," he said quietly, "and those riders approaching your ranch are his warriors." The words hit McKenna like a physical blow. Geronimo was perhaps the most famous and feared Apache leader in the entire Southwest. His name was spoken in hushed tones around army campfires and in frontier towns from Texas to California. For over 2 decades, he had led his people in a desperate war of survival against overwhelming odds, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness toward his enemies. McKenna sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. He had offered shelter to the sons of the most wanted man in Arizona territory. Every military post in the region had standing orders to capture or kill Geronimo on sight. The bounty on his head was enormous, and his raids had made him a household name throughout the frontier. "You could have told me," McKenna said after a moment, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "Would it have changed what you did?" Nate asked, his dark eyes searching McKenna's face. McKenna considered the question honestly. 2 days ago, if someone had asked him what he would do if he found Geronimo's sons dying of thirst on his doorstep, he might have given a different answer. But now, after sharing meals with these young men, working alongside them, and seeing their character and dignity, he realized the truth. "No," he said finally. "It wouldn't have changed anything." Relief flickered across both brothers' faces. Taza stepped forward slightly. "Our father will want to know why a white man helped his sons when he could have turned them over to the soldiers for a reward." "Then I guess I'll have to explain it to him," McKenna replied, standing and checking his revolver one more time. Not because he planned to use it, but because facing Geronimo unarmed would be foolish regardless of the circumstances. The sound of horses had stopped just outside the range of the cabin's lamplight. McKenna could sense the presence of many riders in the darkness beyond his door, but he couldn't see them clearly. The silence that followed the cessation of hoofbeats was somehow more ominous than the approaching thunder had been. Nate moved toward the door. "I should go to him first," he said. "Explain what happened and why you are not a threat." McKenna nodded. "That might be best." The young Apache opened the door slowly and stepped out into the darkness. McKenna could hear him speaking in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. The response came from somewhere in the shadows, spoken in a voice that carried unmistakable authority and power. Even without understanding the words, McKenna could tell he was hearing Geronimo himself speak. The conversation continued for several minutes. McKenna caught his own name mentioned several times, along with words he didn't recognize. Taza remained in the cabin, standing near the window, but staying back from the glass. His expression was unreadable, but McKenna could sense the young man's tension. Finally, Nate returned to the cabin. "He wants to see you," he announced. "He will come alone, but his warriors will remain ready." McKenna nodded and followed Nate outside. The night air was cool against his face, and he could smell the dust raised by many horses. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to make out shapes in the shadows. Mounted warriors sat motionless on their horses in a wide semicircle around his cabin, their presence more felt than seen. A single figure detached itself from the group and walked forward into the pool of light cast by the cabin's windows. McKenna found himself face to face with the most feared war leader in Apache history. Geronimo was not a large man physically, standing perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall with a compact, muscular build. But there was something in his presence that immediately commanded attention and respect. His weathered face showed the accumulated wisdom and hardship of nearly 60 years of life, much of it spent in warfare. His long, gray-streaked hair was bound back, and he wore traditional Apache clothing that had seen hard use in the field. But it was his eyes that struck McKenna most forcefully. Dark and intelligent, they seemed to take in every detail of McKenna's appearance, assessing him with the skill of a man who had survived decades of conflict by accurately reading other people's intentions and capabilities. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply studied each other in the lamplight, each taking the measure of his counterpart. McKenna felt as though he was being examined by a force of nature, something as elemental and dangerous as a mountain storm. When Geronimo finally spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "You are the man who helped my sons." "I am," McKenna replied simply. "Why?" The question was direct and demanded an honest answer. McKenna considered his words carefully. "Because they needed help, and I was able to give it." Geronimo's expression didn't change, but McKenna sensed the Apache leader was evaluating not just his words, but everything about him: his posture, his tone, his willingness to meet his gaze directly. "You are a soldier," Geronimo observed. It wasn't a question. "I was," McKenna confirmed. "Not anymore." "You fought my people?" "I did." Again, that penetrating stare. "And yet you helped my sons." McKenna chose his words carefully. "Your sons are not my enemies. They're just 2 young men who needed water and shelter." For the first time, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corners of Geronimo's mouth. "You speak like a man who thinks for himself." "I tried to." Geronimo nodded slowly, then called out something in Apache. Nate immediately appeared at his father's side, followed moments later by Taza. The war chief spoke to his sons in their native language, asking what McKenna assumed were detailed questions about their treatment and the circumstances of their rescue. Both young men responded at length, gesturing toward McKenna and the cabin. McKenna caught occasional English words mixed in with the Apache, and he could tell from their tone and body language that they were speaking positively about their experience. When they finished, Geronimo turned back to McKenna. "My sons tell me you shared your food, gave them your bed, and asked for nothing in return." "That's correct." "They also tell me you treated them with respect, as equals rather than prisoners or curiosities." McKenna nodded. "They earned that respect." Geronimo studied him for another long moment. In the background, McKenna could sense the presence of the waiting warriors, still mounted and ready for action at a word from their leader. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Thomas McKenna," Geronimo said finally, pronouncing the name carefully. "You have done something unexpected. In a time when my people and yours are at war, you chose to show kindness to Apache children. This is not common among your kind." "Maybe it should be more common," McKenna replied. This time, Geronimo did smile, though it was barely visible in the lamplight. Perhaps. But the world is what it is, not what we wish it to be. The Apache leader took a step closer, and McKenna forced himself to remain relaxed despite every instinct telling him he was in mortal danger. Geronimo's presence was like standing near a barely contained wildfire, beautiful and terrible at the same time. You could have turned my sons over to the soldiers, Geronimo continued. The reward would have been substantial. Instead, you risked your own safety to help them. This creates a debt. McKenna shook his head. No debt. I did what any decent person should do. You did what few of your people would do, Geronimo corrected. This creates a bond between us, whether you accept it or not. The war chief reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something small. He held it out to McKenna, a beautifully crafted silver and turquoise pendant on a leather cord. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of skilled Apache artisans. This belonged to my grandfather, Geronimo explained. It has protected our family through many battles and much hardship. I give it to you as a token of our gratitude and a symbol of the protection my family owes you. McKenna hesitated. Accepting such a valuable and obviously meaningful gift felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But he also sensed that refusing it would be deeply insulting to the man offering it. I'm honored, he said, accepting the pendant. The silver felt warm in his palm, and the turquoise seemed to glow in the lamplight. But I don't need protection from your family. Perhaps not today, Geronimo replied. But the future is uncertain, and debts must be acknowledged. Wear it, and know that you have friends among the Apache people. McKenna slipped the cord over his head, feeling the weight of the pendant against his chest. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of a connection he had never expected to have. My sons will return with us now, Geronimo announced. They are recovered and strong enough to travel. Nate and Taza both stepped forward, and McKenna realized this might be the last time he would see them. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. Over the past 2 days, he had grown genuinely fond of both young men. Travel safely, he told them. You're welcome back here anytime. Both brothers smiled, and Nate clasped McKenna's hand in the Apache manner. We will not forget your kindness, he said solemnly. Taza, still shy but clearly moved, managed a few words in English. Thank you for everything, Mr. McKenna. You are a good man. Geronimo watched this exchange with apparent approval. When his sons had said their goodbyes, he turned back to McKenna one final time. Thomas McKenna, he said formally, you have shown that understanding between our peoples is possible. Perhaps, in time, others will follow your example. I hope so, McKenna replied honestly. The Apache leader nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward the darkness where his warriors waited. Nate and Taza followed, disappearing into the shadows as silently as ghosts. McKenna heard quiet conversation in Apache, the sound of men mounting horses, and then the gradual departure of the war party. But they didn't all leave immediately. McKenna realized that a significant number of warriors were remaining behind, positioned around his ranch in what appeared to be protective positions. When he started to step forward to investigate, Geronimo's voice came out of the darkness. My men will watch over you tonight, the war chief explained. Tomorrow, they will follow our trail, but tonight they ensure your safety. Is that necessary? McKenna called back. There are other white men in this territory who might not understand the friendship that now exists between us, came the reply. And there are Apache who might not understand it either. Tonight, there will be no misunderstandings. With that cryptic statement, Geronimo and the main body of his warriors departed, leaving behind what McKenna estimated to be perhaps 20 men to stand guard around his property. He could occasionally glimpse movement in the shadows, but for the most part, the Apache sentries were invisible. McKenna returned to his cabin, his mind spinning from the evening's events. He sat heavily in his chair, fingering the pendant that now hung around his neck. 2 days ago, he had been a simple rancher living in peaceful isolation. Now he was under the protection of Geronimo's warriors and bound by bonds of friendship to the most wanted man in the Southwest. He thought about the conversation he had just had, replaying every word and gesture. Geronimo had been nothing like what he had expected. The Apache leader was certainly formidable and clearly dangerous, but he had also shown intelligence, honor, and a capacity for gratitude that contradicted everything McKenna had heard about him in military circles. As the night progressed, McKenna found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He could sense the presence of the Apache guard around his property, and while he knew they were there for his protection, their presence also served as a reminder of how dramatically his life had just changed. He thought about Nate and Taza, wondering where they were going and what their lives would be like in the days to come. Both young men had impressed him with their intelligence and character, and he found himself hoping they would find happiness and safety in an increasingly dangerous world. Sometime near dawn, McKenna finally dozed fitfully in his chair. When he woke a few hours later, the sun was already climbing toward its midday position, and the Apache guards had vanished as silently as they had arrived. The only evidence of the previous night's events was the pendant around his neck, and the memory of one of the most extraordinary encounters of his life. As he prepared his breakfast and went about his morning chores, McKenna reflected on what had happened and what it might mean for his future. He had crossed a line the previous evening, establishing a friendship with a man his own government considered a mortal enemy. There would be consequences to that friendship, though he couldn't yet imagine what they might be. What he did know was that he had acted according to his conscience and had been rewarded with an experience that had changed his understanding of the conflict raging across the Southwest. For the first time in years, he felt hope that the violence and hatred that had consumed so much of his adult life might not be inevitable. But, as he would soon discover, hope and reality were two very different things, and the consequences of his act of kindness were only beginning to unfold. 3 weeks passed quietly after Geronimo's visit, and McKenna had almost begun to believe that his extraordinary encounter might remain a secret. He went about his daily routine of caring for his cattle and maintaining his ranch, the silver and turquoise pendant hidden beneath his shirt as a constant reminder of that remarkable night. The peaceful interlude ended abruptly on a scorching Tuesday morning when a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the approach of visitors. McKenna shaded his eyes against the blazing sun and counted at least a dozen riders heading toward his ranch at a steady pace. Even at a distance, he could see the blue uniforms that identified them as cavalry soldiers. His stomach tightened as he recognized the lead rider. Captain William Harrison was a career Army officer whom McKenna knew from his own military service. Harrison was a competent soldier, but also a man driven by ambition and an uncompromising hatred for all Apache people. If anyone would cause trouble over McKenna's recent activities, it would be him. The patrol rode into his yard with military precision, their horses lathered with sweat from the long ride in the desert heat. Captain Harrison dismounted and approached McKenna with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and respect. His weathered face showed the strain of campaigning in hostile territory, and his pale blue eyes held a hardness that came from years of frontier warfare. "Thomas McKenna," Harrison said without preamble. "We need to talk." "Captain Harrison," McKenna replied, keeping his voice neutral. "What brings you out to my ranch?" Harrison gestured to his men to dismount and rest their horses, then fixed McKenna with a stern stare. "We've had reports of Apache activity in this area. Large groups moving through territory that should be under Army control. You seen anything unusual lately?" McKenna felt the weight of the pendant against his chest and chose his words carefully. "I've seen some Apache sign, but that's not unusual out here. They've always traveled through this valley." "This wasn't normal travel," Harrison replied sharply. "We're talking about war parties, McKenna. Significant numbers of warriors moving in organized formations. The kind of activity that usually means trouble for white settlements." The captain stepped closer, his tone becoming more aggressive. "Now, I know you live out here alone, and I know you're tough enough to handle most situations. But we're talking about Geronimo's band, possibly Geronimo himself. If they've been in this area, you would have seen something." McKenna met Harrison steadily. "Like I said, Captain, I've seen some Apache sign. Nothing that seemed threatening." Harrison studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing that McKenna wasn't telling him everything. The two men had served together briefly during McKenna's final year in the Army, and Harrison knew that McKenna was neither a coward nor a fool. If he was being evasive, there had to be a reason. "McKenna," Harrison said finally, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Have you had any contact with Apache warriors in the past month?" The moment of truth had arrived. McKenna could lie outright, but Harrison was suspicious enough that he might press the issue. He could tell the truth and face the consequences, or he could try to find a middle ground that wouldn't compromise either his integrity or his safety. "I've had contact," McKenna admitted, "but not the kind you're thinking about." Harrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. "Explain." McKenna told a version of the story that was true as far as it went. He described finding two young Apache men dying of thirst near his ranch and providing them with water and shelter until they recovered. He mentioned that other Apache had come looking for them and that all parties had departed peacefully. What he didn't mention was the identity of the young men or their father. He didn't describe the extraordinary conversation with Geronimo or the protective guard that had been left around his ranch. And he certainly didn't mention the pendant that now hung around his neck. Harrison listened to this edited version with growing frustration. "You're telling me that you harbored Apache warriors on your property and then let them go?" "I'm telling you that I gave water to two dying boys and helped them get back to their people," McKenna replied firmly. "If that's against Army regulations, then I guess I'll have to live with the consequences." "It's not just against regulations, McKenna. It's potentially treasonous. Those boys could have been gathering intelligence about military movements in this area. They could have been planning raids against settlements or supply trains." McKenna shook his head. "They were half dead from dehydration, Captain. They weren't gathering intelligence on anybody." Harrison turned away, clearly struggling to control his temper. When he turned back, his face was flushed with anger. "You always were too soft on the Apache, McKenna. It's one of the reasons you never made officer rank." The insult stung, but McKenna refused to take the bait. "Maybe I'm soft, Captain. Or maybe I just think there's a difference between warriors and children." "There is no difference." Harrison exploded. "Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors. Everyone you show mercy to is another enemy you'll face later. That's the reality of this war, and the sooner you accept it, the better." Several of Harrison's soldiers had moved closer during this exchange, and McKenna could see the hostile expressions on their faces. These men had been fighting Apache raids for months or years, and they had little sympathy for anyone who showed kindness to their enemies. Sergeant O'Malley, a grizzled Irish veteran with scars on his hands and face, stepped forward. "Captain, if he's been helping the hostiles, maybe we should bring him in for questioning. Let the colonel sort this out." Harrison considered this suggestion seriously. Arresting a former soldier for aiding the enemy would send a clear message to other settlers about the consequences of helping Apache. It would also eliminate any possibility that McKenna might provide future assistance to Geronimo or his followers. "That's tempting, Sergeant," Harrison mused. "But McKenna hasn't actually committed any crime that I can prove. Giving water to dying men isn't illegal, even if those men are Apache." The captain fixed McKenna with another stern stare. "But I'll tell you what is going to happen. From now on, this ranch is under observation. My patrols will be checking on you regularly, and if we find any evidence that you're providing aid or comfort to hostile Apache, you'll be arrested immediately." McKenna nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't think you do," Harrison continued. "Let me make this crystal clear. Geronimo is a wanted fugitive with a substantial price on his head. Anyone who helps him or his followers is considered an enemy of the United States government. That includes former soldiers who should know better." With that threat hanging in the air, Harrison ordered his men to remount. As they prepared to leave, the captain delivered one final warning. "Think carefully about where your loyalties lie, McKenna. This territory is changing, and there's going to be no room for fence-sitters. You're either with us or against us, and if you're against us, we'll treat you accordingly." The patrol rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving McKenna alone with his thoughts and his growing concerns. Harrison's visit had made several things clear. First, the Army knew about Apache activity in the area, which meant Geronimo's movements were being tracked more closely than McKenna had realized. Second, his own position was now precarious, with military authorities suspicious of his activities and watching for any sign of further contact with Apache. Most troubling of all was the realization that his act of kindness had placed him in a position where he might be forced to choose between his loyalty to his own people and his newfound friendship with Geronimo's family. It was a choice he had never wanted to face, and one that could have deadly consequences regardless of what he decided. Over the following days, McKenna noticed subtle signs that Harrison had made good on his threat. Dust clouds on distant ridges suggested military patrols keeping his ranch under observation. He occasionally spotted glints of sunlight reflecting off metal objects in the hills around his property, probably field glasses or rifle scopes. The Army was definitely watching him. The constant surveillance made him nervous and angry. As a former soldier, he understood the military's concerns about Apache activity in the territory. But as a private citizen trying to live peacefully on his own land, he resented being treated like a suspected traitor because he had shown basic human decency to two young men in distress. The situation became more complicated when he discovered signs that Apache scouts were also keeping an eye on his ranch. Subtle disturbances in the landscape, footprints that appeared and disappeared overnight, and the occasional glimpse of movement in places where no movement should occur all suggested that Geronimo's people were monitoring his safety just as closely as the Army was monitoring his activities. McKenna found himself caught in the middle of a dangerous game. The military suspected him of collaborating with their enemies, while the Apache were apparently protecting him from potential threats. Both sides were watching him constantly, and any wrong move could trigger violence that would destroy everything he had worked to build. The tension reached a breaking point on a Friday evening 2 weeks after Harrison's visit. McKenna was finishing his dinner when he heard the soft whinny of a horse outside his cabin. Moving carefully to the window, he peered out into the gathering darkness and saw a lone Apache warrior sitting motionless on his horse about 50 yards from the cabin. McKenna recognized the rider as one of the men who had accompanied Geronimo on that memorable night 3 weeks earlier. The warrior raised his hand, a gesture that was clearly meant to request a meeting, then dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin. McKenna opened his door and stepped outside, acutely aware that Army observers might be watching this encounter through field glasses from surrounding hills. If Harrison's men witnessed a meeting with an Apache warrior, it would provide the evidence they needed to arrest him for collaboration. The warrior spoke softly in English with a heavy Apache accent. "Thomas McKenna, I bring a message from the one you helped." "What kind of message?" "You are in danger," the Apache said simply. "The soldiers plan to arrest you soon. They seek evidence of your friendship with our people, and they will create such evidence if they cannot find it." McKenna felt his blood run cold. "How do you know this?" "We have friends among the Mexican traders who visit the army posts. They hear soldiers talking. They hear plans being made." The warrior stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "There is more. Some of our own people are not happy about the friendship between our leader and a white man. They say it shows weakness, that it encourages our enemies to think we can be bought with small kindnesses." This was news McKenna hadn't expected. He had assumed that Geronimo's decision to befriend him would be accepted without question by his followers. The possibility that Apache warriors might view him as a threat to their leader's reputation added another dangerous element to an already volatile situation. "What does Geronimo want me to do?" McKenna asked. The warrior reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "He offers you a choice. You can leave this place and join our band. We will protect you from the soldiers and treat you as a brother. Or you can stay and face whatever the soldiers plan for you." McKenna accepted the paper, but didn't unfold it immediately. The offer was both generous and impossible. Joining Geronimo's band would mean abandoning everything he had built, becoming a fugitive from his own people, and living as an outlaw for the rest of his life. But staying meant facing almost certain arrest and possible execution as a traitor. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. 3 days, the warrior replied. "If you choose to come with us, be ready at sunset on the 3rd day. If you choose to stay, we will respect your decision, but we cannot protect you from what follows." With that, the Apache warrior melted back into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. McKenna stood alone outside his cabin, holding a piece of paper that contained one of the most important decisions of his life. Inside the cabin, by the light of his oil lamp, McKenna unfolded the message. It was written in careful English script, obviously by someone educated in white schools, but with the unmistakable dignity that characterized everything connected to Geronimo. "Thomas McKenna," the message read, "you showed kindness to my sons when you could have shown cruelty. You treated them as human beings when others would have seen only enemies. This created a bond between us that cannot be broken by the fears and hatred of others. Your own people now see you as a threat because of this friendship. Mine question whether such friendship serves our cause. Both groups are wrong, but both are dangerous to you. I offer you a place among us not because I need another warrior, but because I value your character and your courage. You would be welcome in our band and safe from those who seek to harm you for doing what was right. But I also understand if you cannot abandon the life you have built. A man's roots run deep, and not every good man is meant to be a wanderer in the desert. Choose according to your heart, and know that either choice will be honored. The message was signed with a simple G. McKenna sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. On one hand, staying meant facing almost certain arrest, trial, and possible execution. The army was looking for any excuse to make an example of someone, and his friendship with Geronimo made him a perfect target. On the other hand, leaving meant abandoning his ranch, his cattle, his carefully constructed new life, and everything he had worked to build since leaving the army. It meant becoming a fugitive and an outlaw, forever cut off from the civilization he had known. But as he thought about it more deeply, McKenna realized the choice wasn't really about staying or leaving. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of life he was willing to accept. He could stay and compromise his principles to satisfy military authorities, essentially betraying the friendship that had come to mean so much to him. Or he could remain true to his convictions and accept the consequences, whatever they might be. As he sat in his cabin that night, fingering the pendant that Geronimo had given him, McKenna began to understand that his decision had already been made. It had been made the moment he chose to help two dying young men instead of turning them over to the authorities. Everything that had happened since then was simply the inevitable result of that initial choice. The question now wasn't what he should do, but whether he had the courage to see his decision through to its conclusion. And as the oil in his lamp began to burn low and the desert night settled around his cabin, Thomas McKenna began to prepare for the most difficult 3 days of his life. McKenna spent the next 2 days in a state of carefully controlled tension, going through the motions of his daily routine while his mind wrestled with the impossible decision before him. He fed his cattle, repaired sections of fence, and maintained his equipment, all while acutely aware that these might be his final days as a free man on his own land. The surveillance around his ranch had intensified since the Apache warriors' visit. McKenna could see army patrols moving along the distant ridges with increasing frequency, and he had spotted at least 3 different observation posts in the hills overlooking his property. Captain Harrison was clearly preparing for something, and McKenna suspected he knew what it was. On the morning of the second day, McKenna made a decision about his livestock. If he chose to leave with Geronimo, he couldn't simply abandon his cattle and horses to starve. And if he chose to stay and was arrested, the army would likely confiscate everything anyway. Either way, the animals needed to be cared for by someone else. He saddled his best horse and rode to the ranch of his nearest neighbor, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who lived about 15 miles to the east. Weber was a practical man who minded his own business and had always maintained friendly relations with McKenna despite their different backgrounds. Weber listened carefully as McKenna explained that he might need to leave the territory suddenly, on urgent business, and asked if Weber would be willing to care for his livestock in exchange for half the cattle. It was a generous offer, and Weber was smart enough to realize there was more to the story than McKenna was telling. "Thomas," Weber said in his heavily accented English, "you are in some kind of trouble, yes?" McKenna nodded. "Trouble I didn't ask for, but trouble nonetheless." Weber studied his face for a moment, then extended his hand. "I take care of your animals. You take care of yourself." The simple gesture of friendship meant more to McKenna than he could express. As he rode back to his ranch that afternoon, he felt at least some satisfaction in knowing that his livestock would be in good hands regardless of what happened to him. That evening, as sunset approached on his second day, McKenna found himself standing on his porch and looking out over the desert landscape he had come to love. The red rocks and distant mountains painted by the dying light created a scene of stunning beauty that never failed to move him. The thought of never seeing it again filled him with a profound sadness. He was still standing there when he heard the sound of approaching horses. This time, however, the riders were coming from the direction of the military road, and they wore blue uniforms. McKenna counted 8 soldiers led by Captain Harrison himself. They rode into his yard with grim determination, and McKenna knew his time had run out. "Thomas McKenna," Harrison announced without dismounting, "you're under arrest for providing aid and comfort to hostile Apache forces." McKenna felt a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. The waiting was over, and now he would face whatever consequences his actions had earned. "What's the specific charge, Captain?" "Treason," Harrison replied bluntly. "We have witnesses who will testify that you've been in regular communication with Geronimo's band and have provided them with intelligence about military movements in this area." McKenna knew the charges were fabricated, but he also knew that didn't matter. In a territory where military law often superseded civilian justice, the Army could make almost any accusation stick if they were determined enough. "I have a right to legal representation," McKenna said calmly. Harrison's smile was without warmth. "You'll get a military tribunal, same as any other traitor. Now mount up. We're taking you to Fort Bowie for questioning." As McKenna prepared to comply, Sergeant O'Malley dismounted and began searching the cabin. Within minutes, he emerged with a satisfied expression and something in his hand that made McKenna's heart sink. "Look what I found hidden under his mattress, Captain," O'Malley announced, holding up a leather pouch that McKenna had never seen before. The sergeant opened it to reveal several pieces of silver jewelry in distinctive Apache style, along with what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of the surrounding territory. Well, Harrison said with obvious satisfaction. "It seems our friend McKenna has been receiving payment for his services. And look at these maps, Sergeant. They show every water source and defensible position within 50 miles. McKenna stared at the planted evidence in disbelief. The jewelry and maps had obviously been placed in his cabin while he was away visiting Weber, probably by soldiers who had broken in during the night. The fabrication was clumsy, but effective, providing exactly the kind of physical evidence that Harrison needed to justify his actions. "Those aren't mine," McKenna said firmly. "And you know it. That's for the tribunal to decide," Harrison replied. "What I know is that we found evidence of collaboration in your possession, and that's enough to hold you for trial." As the soldiers prepared to bind McKenna's hands, the sound of gunfire erupted from the hills surrounding the ranch. Not the scattered shots of a skirmish, but the coordinated volleys of a planned attack. Harrison's men immediately went for their weapons, but before they could draw them, Apache warriors seemed to materialize from every direction. McKenna had never seen anything like it. One moment the ranch yard contained only soldiers and himself. The next, it was filled with mounted Apache fighters who had appeared as if by magic. The military patrol was completely surrounded, outnumbered at least 3-1, with no possibility of escape or effective resistance. Geronimo himself rode into the center of the group, his presence commanding immediate attention from both soldiers and warriors. He sat his horse with calm authority while his men kept their weapons trained on the Army patrol. The Apache leader's dark eyes surveyed the scene, taking in every detail before speaking. "Captain Harrison," Geronimo said in clear English, "you are trespassing on land that belongs to a friend of the Apache people." Harrison's face had gone pale, but he managed to maintain his composure. "This man is under arrest for treason against the United States government. You have no authority here." Geronimo's expression didn't change, but Something in his voice suggested barely controlled anger. "I have the authority of justice, Captain. This man committed no crime except showing kindness to Apache children. For this, you would kill him with your false accusations and planted evidence." The fact that Geronimo knew about the planted evidence clearly shook Harrison. McKenna realized that Apache scouts must have been watching the cabin when the soldiers broke in to hide the jewelry and maps. Nothing that happened on his ranch had escaped their attention. "Release him," Geronimo commanded, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a request. "I can't do that," Harrison replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I have my orders." "Then you will die with your orders," Geronimo said simply. The standoff stretched for several tense moments, with both sides ready for violence at the slightest provocation. McKenna found himself in the surreal position of being both prisoner and protected party, caught between two forces that were prepared to fight over his fate. Finally, McKenna stepped forward. "Geronimo," he said respectfully, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't the way. If your warriors kill these soldiers, the army will send hundreds more. Innocent people will die, including your own." The Apache leader looked at him with what might have been approval. "You would protect the men who came to arrest you?" "I would prevent unnecessary bloodshed," McKenna replied. "There's been too much killing already." Geronimo considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You speak wisdom. But neither can we allow them to take you to their fort to be murdered by their false justice." The war chief turned back to Harrison. "I offer you a choice, Captain. Take your men and leave this place. Forget that Thomas McKenna exists. In return, we will not follow you back to your fort, and this incident will end here." "And if I refuse?" Harrison asked. "Then you and your men will not leave this place alive," Geronimo replied matter-of-factly. Harrison looked around at the Apache warriors surrounding his patrol. Everyone was an experienced fighter, and all were ready for battle. The odds were impossibly against him, and continuing this confrontation would be suicide for his entire command. But Harrison was also a career officer who couldn't simply back down from a direct challenge, especially not in front of his men. The humiliation of retreating from a group of Apache would follow him for the rest of his military career. "I need guarantees," he said finally. "If I release McKenna and withdraw, how do I know your people won't attack military patrols in retaliation for this incident?" Geronimo reached into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he took what appeared to be a white stone and held it up for Harrison to see. "This is a treaty stone," he explained. "As long as Thomas McKenna remains safe and unmolested by your soldiers, this stone will remind my warriors that we have made peace in this place. But if harm comes to him through your actions, the stone will be broken, and we will consider it an act of war." It was a face-saving compromise that allowed Harrison to withdraw without appearing to surrender completely. The captain studied the stone for a moment, then looked around at his surrounded men. He was trapped, and everyone present knew it. "Release the prisoner," Harrison ordered reluctantly. Sergeant O'Malley cut the ropes, binding McKenna's hands, his expression showing how much he disliked following the order. As soon as McKenna was free, several Apache warriors moved closer to him, clearly prepared to defend him if the soldiers changed their minds. "This isn't over," Harrison warned as his men prepared to mount up. "McKenna is still a wanted man, and we'll be watching for any opportunity to bring him to justice." "Watch if you wish," Geronimo replied, "but do not act. The treaty stone will remember any broken promises." As the army patrol rode away in humiliation and defeat, McKenna found himself surrounded by Apache warriors who regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect. He had just witnessed one of the most extraordinary rescues in frontier history, and he still wasn't entirely sure what it meant for his future. Geronimo dismounted and approached him with the same calm dignity he had shown during their first meeting. "Thomas McKenna," he said formally, "you have seen today what it means to be a friend of the Apache people. We do not abandon those who have earned our trust." "I am grateful," McKenna replied honestly, "but this rescue has made my situation even more complicated. Harrison won't give up, and now the entire army will know that I'm under Apache protection. Then perhaps it is time for you to make the choice we offered," Geronimo suggested. "Your old life is gone, whether you accept it or not. The question is what kind of new life you will build." McKenna looked around at the assembled warriors, then back at his ranch buildings. Everything he had worked for was indeed gone now. Harrison's accusations and the dramatic rescue had made it impossible for him to continue living as a peaceful rancher. He could try to flee to another territory, but the army's reach was long, and his reputation would follow him wherever he went. Or he could accept Geronimo's offer and join a people who had shown him more loyalty and honor than his own government had. "If I come with you," McKenna said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" "Nothing more than what you have already shown," Geronimo replied. "Honor, courage, and loyalty to those who deserve it. We do not ask you to fight your own people, only to live among ours with dignity and respect." It wasn't really a choice anymore, McKenna realized. His old life had ended the moment Captain Harrison rode into his yard with false charges and planted evidence. The only real question was whether he would face an uncertain future alone or with people who had proven they valued his friendship enough to risk their lives for it. McKenna fingered the pendant around his neck, feeling the weight of silver and turquoise that had become a symbol of everything that had changed in his life. Then he looked up at Geronimo with a decision that felt both inevitable and right. "I need to get a few things from the cabin," he said quietly. For the first time since McKenna had known him, Geronimo smiled broadly. "Take what you need," he said. "But remember that among the Apache, a man's true wealth is measured in friends, not possessions." As McKenna gathered his few essential belongings, he realized that his extraordinary journey was just beginning. He had started as a simple rancher trying to live in peace, become the friend of the most feared war chief in the Southwest, and now was about to become something entirely new. Whatever that something was, he would face it with the same courage and integrity that had brought him to this moment. And for the first time in days, that felt like enough. The Apache camp was unlike anything McKenna had expected. Hidden in a natural basin surrounded by towering red cliffs and accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended, it was both a fortress and a home. Nearly 300 people lived here, from elderly grandmothers to children barely old enough to walk, creating a community that felt both temporary and eternal. McKenna's arrival caused considerable interest among the Apache. Many had heard the story of the white man who had helped Geronimo's sons, but few had expected him to actually join their band. He found himself the object of curious stares and whispered conversations as Geronimo led him through the camp to a small wickiup that had been prepared for his use. The traditional Apache dwelling was simple but functional, constructed from bent poles covered with brush and hides. Inside, McKenna found a comfortable bed of furs, basic cooking implements, and a few personal items that had clearly been chosen with care. Someone had even provided him with traditional Apache clothing to replace his ranch clothes, which would have made him conspicuous if military patrols spotted the camp. "This will be your home for as long as you choose to stay with us," Geronimo explained. "Nate and Taza requested the honor of being your sponsors as you learn our ways." The two young men McKenna had helped emerge from behind their father, both grinning with obvious pleasure at seeing him again. They looked healthier and stronger than when he had first found them, but their eyes still held the gratitude and respect that had marked their farewell at his ranch. "Mr. McKenna," Nate said formally, "we are honored to welcome you to our people. We hope to repay some of the kindness you showed us." "The honor is mine," McKenna replied, and meant it sincerely. Over the following days, McKenna began the challenging process of adapting to Apache life. Everything was different from what he had known, from the food they ate to the way they organized their daily activities. The Apache lived in harmony with the desert in ways that amazed him, finding water where he saw only rocks, reading signs in a landscape that were invisible to his untrained eyes, and moving through hostile territory with a stealth and efficiency that military scouts could only dream of achieving. Nate and Taza proved to be excellent teachers, patient with his mistakes and generous with their knowledge. They taught him basic Apache words and phrases, showed him how to construct and maintain a wiki-up, and instructed him in the subtle skills of desert survival. Most importantly, they helped him understand the complex social structure of the band and his place within it. The Apache were a hierarchical society, but one based on merit rather than birth. Respect was earned through demonstrated courage, wisdom, and service to the community. As a newcomer and an outsider, McKenna started at the bottom of this hierarchy, but he was given opportunities to prove himself and advance according to his abilities. His first real test came during his second week in the camp. Apache scouts brought word that a military patrol was approaching the area, apparently searching for sign of the band's location. The community needed to relocate quickly, and everyone had specific responsibilities for moving people and supplies without leaving traces that soldiers could follow. McKenna was assigned to help with the horses, work that suited his ranch background perfectly. But as the camp prepared to move, he noticed an elderly Apache woman sitting alone near her wiki-up, clearly in distress. Her grandson translated her problem. She had injured her leg and couldn't walk the distance to the new camp location, but she was too proud to ask for help. Without hesitation, McKenna approached the woman and offered to carry her personal belongings so she could lean on him for support during the journey. It was a simple gesture, but one that was noticed by many in the community. Here was a white man who had voluntarily left his own people to live among the Apache, and now he was offering to help an elderly woman who couldn't help him in return. The relocation took most of the day, with the entire band moving through rugged terrain that would have challenged experienced hikers. McKenna helped the elderly woman every step of the way, never complaining about the additional burden or the slower pace required to accommodate her needs. By the time they reached the new camp location, his actions had earned him considerable respect among people who valued such displays of character. That evening, as the band settled into their new location, Geronimo approached McKenna with an expression of approval. "You begin to understand our ways," the war chief observed. "Among the Apache, a person's worth is measured by their willingness to help those who cannot help themselves." "It seemed like the right thing to do," McKenna replied. "Many people know what is right," Geronimo said. "Fewer choose to do what is right when it costs them something." As weeks passed, McKenna found himself increasingly integrated into the band's daily life. He participated in hunting expeditions, learning to track game through terrain that had seemed empty and lifeless when he first arrived in the Southwest. He helped with camp security, using his military experience to suggest improvements in defensive preparations. Most importantly, he began to develop genuine friendships with people who had initially viewed him as a curiosity. The children were particularly accepting of his presence. They found his attempts to speak Apache hilarious, delighting in correcting his pronunciation and teaching him new words. The fact that their fathers and grandfathers trusted him was enough for them, and they soon included him in their games and daily activities with the casual acceptance that only children can show. But it was the adult members of the band who provided McKenna with the most meaningful relationships. He spent long evenings listening to the stories of warriors who had fought in dozens of battles, learning about Apache history and traditions from people who had lived through the most turbulent period in their people's existence. These men and women had seen their traditional way of life systematically destroyed by advancing American settlement, but they maintained their dignity and cultural identity with a strength that humbled him. One of these relationships proved particularly important. Cochise, an elder warrior who had lost his arm in a battle with Mexican soldiers years earlier, became something of a mentor to McKenna. Despite his disability, Cochise remained one of the most respected members of the band, known for his wisdom and his ability to see situations from multiple perspectives. "You have given up much to be here," Cochise observed during one of their conversations. "Your own people, your land, your familiar ways of life. But what have you gained?" McKenna considered the question carefully. "Understanding," he said finally. "For years, I fought against people I didn't really know. Now I'm learning who they really are." Cochise nodded approvingly. "That is wisdom, but understanding alone is not enough. What will you do with this knowledge?" It was a question McKenna couldn't answer immediately, but one that stayed with him as he continued to adapt to Apache life. He was learning more than just survival skills and cultural traditions. He was developing a new perspective on the conflict that had consumed so much of his adult life, seeing it through the eyes of people who were fighting not for conquest or glory, but simply for the right to exist. This new understanding was tested when Apache scouts brought disturbing news to the camp. Captain Harrison had not given up his pursuit of McKenna, and had apparently convinced his superiors that capturing the Apache sympathizer was crucial to military success in the territory. Large patrols were combing the region, offering substantial rewards for information about McKenna's whereabouts, and threatening severe punishment for anyone found helping him. Even more troubling was the news that some of these patrols included Apache scouts from other bands, warriors who had accepted military employment in exchange for protection for their own people. The complex politics of survival in the territory meant that not all Apache were allies, and some were actively working with the army to track down Geronimo's band. "They use our own people against us," Geronimo said grimly when the scouts made their report. "It is an old strategy, but effective." McKenna felt the weight of responsibility for the danger his presence had brought to the band. "Maybe I should leave," he suggested. "Find somewhere else to go, so you don't have to worry about military attention because of me." Several warriors spoke up immediately in opposition to this idea. Over the weeks he had been with them, McKenna had proven his value to the community in numerous ways. His military knowledge had helped them avoid several army patrols. His ranch experience had improved their horse management, and his willingness to share their hardships had earned him genuine acceptance. "You are one of us now," Nate said firmly. "We do not abandon our own when danger comes." This declaration of belonging meant more to McKenna than any official recognition could have. He had found not just refuge among the Apache, but a new identity and a new purpose. The lonely rancher who had simply wanted to live in peace had become something he never expected, a bridge between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. As autumn progressed and the military pressure intensified, McKenna found himself playing an increasingly important role in the band's survival strategies. His knowledge of army tactics and procedures proved invaluable in predicting military movements and avoiding confrontations that the Apache couldn't win. More importantly, his presence among them provided proof that understanding between the two cultures was possible, even in the midst of war. The relationship deepened during a particularly difficult period when food became scarce and several band members fell ill with a fever that their traditional medicine couldn't cure. McKenna remembered treatments he had learned during his military service and was able to help several people recover from the illness. The fact that he used his knowledge to heal Apache rather than harm them further cemented his position in the community. But the most significant moment in his integration came during a ceremony held to honor warriors who had shown exceptional courage in recent raids. To his surprise, McKenna found himself included among those being recognized, not for fighting, but for his willingness to abandon his old life to live according to Apache values. Geronimo himself performed the ceremony, painting traditional symbols on McKenna's face and speaking in Apache while the entire band watched. When the ritual was complete, the war chief translated his words into English. I have said that Thomas McKenna came to us as a stranger, but has become a brother, Geronimo announced. He has shown that it is possible for a white man to live with honor among the Apache people. From this day forward, he bears the name Tsegojuni, which means rock standing alone, because he stood alone for what was right when others would not. The new name brought cheers from the assembled crowd, and McKenna realized that he had been given something he never expected to find again: a home, a family,